When you think of somebody as having style, you probably first think about the way he or she dresses. Well, language is very much like clothing in the fact that you dress up your ideas with the words you choose to use. And just as your wardrobe can give you a very distinctive and attractive style, so can your choice of words give your thoughts a distinctive and attractive form of expression. So really, in that sense, style is a way of expressing yourself. And your speech has memorable style when we use words and phrases that are distinctive. Now, what we're going to start with today is first of all talking about how oral and written style of language differ. Now, I've mentioned a number of times that it's best to not write out a speech word for word because of the differences in terms of the way we write and the way we speak. So there's really at least three major differences between written style and oral style of language. First of all, oral style is more personal. So when you're speaking to somebody, you can look them in the eye, you can talk directly to them. Very rarely is the person reading something that you've written, looking over your shoulder or sitting across the table from you when they read it. Based off of this, we can adjust to feedback, we can read how they're responding, and we can adapt to our audience as we go along. Now, oral style is also less formal. We find that written communication is often much more formal language, style, and structure. That's why, for example, written out and memorized speeches sound written out because the words and phrases are longer, more complex. Where we find that spoken communication is much less formal, uses shorter words and phrases and less complex sentence structure. And then thirdly, oral style is more repetitious. And this is something that we've addressed before in the fact that when somebody's reading something that you've written, they have that luxury of being able to go back and reread something that they missed or didn't understand. But when you're speaking, our only chance to get it is when you say it. And so therefore we build the repetition in to the speech to help the audience with that listening process. Now, let's take a look at using words effectively during our speech. It's your challenge as a speaker to use words well so that we understand whatever your intended message is that you're trying to communicate. So ideally, the language you use should have some very specific characteristics. So let's talk about the characteristics of effective language. First of all, we need to use concrete words. And when we say concrete, that means saying something the most specific way possible. We find that the more abstract and broad it is, the language is, it doesn't really create images and it's not that interesting to listen to. Let's take, for example, if I say the word dog, well, you get, hundreds of different images in your mind of a dog based on your experience. But if I say poodle, that image goes a little bit tighter. But then if I describe this poodle in terms of the way that its hair cut and it's got bows in its hair and painted toenails, that's really tightening up that image and we're mentally seeing exactly what you're talking about. So we need to use concrete words. Next, we need to use unbiased words. Certainly a speaker whose language insults any sexual, racial, cultural, or religious group runs a great risk of offending their audience. Offending your audience is not a very effective way to communicate with them. So even some speakers who would never dream of using overly offensive language might sometimes find falling into the trap of language that may subtly stereotype or discriminate. For example, sexist language might fall into this category. Not too long ago, the term man or mankind very easily stood for everybody. You think about Neil Armstrong stepping off the land onto the surface of the moon, stating one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, today that phrase may have been very different as it became much more inclusive to take into account everybody. We need to use vivid words, and that means we want to make our speech come alive for the minds of the audience, and we can do that by creating images for them by using as vivid language as possible. Now, when I say vivid, I don't mean sailor, colorful, vivid. What I'm talking about is saying things just a little bit differently from the way the audience expects to hear it. So, for example, if you're thinking about saying a certain word, well, look up a synonym for it, something that means the same thing, but it's not a term we always hear. That's going to make it a little bit different and a little bit more interesting to listen to. Now, in doing that, you don't go out there and find the most uncommon word possible, because then we're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. We need to make sure our language is simple. John F. Kennedy's inaugural address in 1961 considered both eloquent and memorable. Practitioners have analyzed some of the most stylistic features of that speech, and perhaps the most significant attribute was actually its simplicity. And that wasn't done by accident. Theodore Sorensen, who was special counsel to the president and his principal speechwriter, has recorded that Kennedy specifically asked him to look into the secret of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which he hoped to emulate. And Sorensen reported that Lincoln never used a 2 or a 3 syllable word where a 1 syllable word would do. He never used 2 or 3 words where 1 word would do. And from this study, guidelines for style and simplicity emerged. So we find that the best language is often the most simplest. Your words and sentences need to be immediately understood by your audience. George Orwell once noted, "Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it's possible to cut a word out, cut it out. Never use a foreign word, scientific word, or jargon if you can think of an everyday, normal word to use instead." Now finally, we need to use words correctly. When you're standing up in front of your audience is not the time to show your lack of understanding of the English language. So maybe trying to sound smart or important by using big words, but in fact using the wrong big words improperly is going to have a very negative effect on your credibility, and it's also going to have an impact on how we're able to understand whatever you're saying. Now we need to talk about crafting memorable word structure with the way we put these words together. Let's say, for example, the President of the United States is coming to speak in your town, and so therefore you decide to attend the speech, and you find that the speech, the 30-minute speech was interesting, educational, entertaining, maybe even infuriating at times. But what you do is, once the speech is over, because all of the media coverage, you go home and turn on the news to try to catch the coverage of the speech that you attended. And you find that every single network is running the same little 15-second soundbite out of that speech. Well, why? What is it that makes certain portions of speeches quotable or memorable? Presidential speechwriter Peggy Noonan once said, "Great speeches have always had great sound bites. They sum up a point or make a point in language that is profound." And we too can craft memorable word structure in our speeches as well. We can do some of the same things that the great speakers do also. So, first of all, what we can do to help us do this is to create drama. And so to create drama, we're basically keeping the audience in suspense or trying to catch them off guard by saying something different from the way they expect it. And we have 3 stylistic devices we can use to create drama. The first thing we can do is what's called omission. And to use omission is where we leave out a word or a phrase that the audience expects to hear. For example, sending a telegram, this captain of a World War II Navy destroyer used omission to inform his headquarters of his successful efforts of sighting and sinking an enemy submarine. He spared all details using omission, saying, "Sighted sub, sank same." Julius Caesar, in his reference to his conquest of Gaul, said, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Now, the next thing that we can do to create drama is through the use of something called inversion. And the technique of basically reversing the normal word order is inversion. For example, putting the verb before the noun. In his eulogy for Daniel Webster, Theodore Parker infused a question drama using inversion, saying, "Do men now mourn for him, the great man eloquent?" Probably your most familiar use of inversion comes from the Star Wars series. If you've ever listened to Yoda speak in any of the Star Wars movies, they utilize inversion in terms of writing his script. It makes him sound very wise. Now, the next thing we can do is use what we call suspension to help us create drama. And think about when you read a mystery novel, you're held in suspense until the whodunit, the denouement. And verbal suspension does something very similar. It occurs when you use a key word at the end of a sentence rather than at the beginning where it might normally show up. So, Abraham Lincoln, leaving Springfield, Illinois, Washington, D.C., told his friends, "To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything." You see it in advertising. And the tagline in a commercial might hold off until the very last word of the commercial to give the name of the product. Things go better with Coke. So it uses that suspension, and it also is the principle of recency in regards of what we hear last, we remember best. All right, so we've talked about creating drama. The next thing that we can do to craft this memorable word structure is to create cadence or rhythm within the speech. Now, we have several devices that we can use to help us create this cadence or this rhythm. The first of which is called parallelism. And with parallelism, you have two or more phrases or sentences that have the same grammatical pattern. Ralph Waldo Emerson, addressing a Phi Beta Kappa organization, stated, "We will walk on our feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds." President Clinton, in speaking to the people of Berlin, stated, "We stand where Europe's heart was cut in half, and we celebrate unity. We stand where crude walls of concrete separated mother from child, and we meet as one family. We stand where those sought a new life and instead found death. We rejoice in renewal." The next thing we can do to create this cadence is the use of antithesis. Now, antithesis literally means opposition. So in language style, antithesis is a sentence that has parallel structure, but the two parts contrast each other. So probably one of our most famous lines of antithesis comes from John F. Kennedy, as he stated, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." The next thing that we can utilize to create this cadence or rhythm is what's called anaphora, and really that is just the repetition of a key word or a phrase. It can give it power and rhythm. Certainly, if you ever have watched Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, you see the repetition of the phrase, "I have a dream," and certainly we cannot be satisfied again and again. Those ring in the ears of the listeners. Dan Rather, in addressing other news colleagues, issued this challenge. "And the constant scratching and scrambling for even better ratings and money and the boss's praise and a better job. It's worth pausing to ask, how goes the real war? The really important battle of our professional lives? How goes the battle for quality, for truth and justice, for programs worthy of the best within ourselves and the audience? How goes the battle against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference? The battle not to be merely wires and lights in a box. The battle to make television not just entertaining, but also at least some little of the time useful for higher, better things. How goes the battle?" So, certainly that repetition of the question, "How goes the battle?" rings in the ears of the listeners long after the passage is complete. Now, the final thing that we can do to create this cadence within our speech and language usage is through the use of alliteration. And alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound. So once again, we go back to Martin Luther King Jr. as he states, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." That repetition of the hard C is alliteration. Now, we've taken a look at creating drama. We've taken a look at creating cadence. The last area we can take a look at with our language style is to create arresting images. So we've said that we want the speech to come alive in the minds of the audience, and so we do that by allowing them to be able to visualize whatever it is that we're talking about. And to create these arresting images, we want to use various figures of speech. Now, we're going to look at 2 different areas. The first types of figures of speech to mention are metaphors and similes. Now, metaphors and similes, these are types of analogies. These are figurative analogies. They're implied comparisons. The only difference between the metaphor and the simile is that the simile uses like or as. So, looking at a metaphor, this implied comparison, in the film Stand and Deliver, the teacher speaking to a group of students stated that education was the vaccine for violence. Now, we know we can't put education into a syringe and shoot it into your arm. No. But through education, we hopefully can start to cure the problem of violence. And certainly, going back to Martin Luther King Jr., as he stated in regards to a simile using like or as, he says, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And then we have what's called personification in regards to creating these arresting images. And personification is the attribution of human qualities to inanimate things. Franklin Roosevelt personified nature as a generous provider in this statement from his first inaugural address, stating, "Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep." Now, some final things to keep in mind when using this language style effectively. First of all, don't overdo it. We can find that too much highly stylized language can draw the focus to the language rather than the content and the message of your speech. Certainly utilize stylistic devices when you want to capture their attention, so we can use these devices as attention getters throughout the speech. And certainly understand that these stylistic devices can be used to economize during the speech. So, for example, when a sentence becomes too long or too complex, see if you can recast them or rewrite them using antithesis, suspension, or omission.